at his best, the essential man, man at his highest possibility, the rational being who acts according to his nature. It should not matter to a creator whether any one or a million or all the men around him fall short of the ideal of man. Let him live up to that ideal himself. This is all the optimism about man that he needs. But this is a hard and subtle thing to realize, and it would be natural for Dagny always to make the mistake of believing others are better than they really are, or will become better, or she will teach them to become better, or actually she so desperately wants them to be better, and to be tied to the world by that hope. It is proper for a creator to have an unlimited confidence in himself and his ability, to feel certain that he can get anything he wishes out of life, that he can accomplish anything he decides to accomplish, and that it's up to him to do it. He feels it because he is a man of reason. But here is what he must keep clearly in mind. It is true that a creator can accomplish anything he wishes, if he functions according to the nature of man, the universe, and his own proper morality. That is, if he does not place his wish primarily within others, and does not attempt or desire anything that is of a collective nature. Anything that concerns others primarily, or requires primarily the exercise of the will of others. This would be an immoral desire or attempt, contrary to his nature as a creator. If he attempts that, he is out of a creator's province, and in that of the collectivist and the second-hander. Therefore, he must never feel confident that he can do anything whatever to, by, or through others. He can't, and he shouldn't even wish to try it, and the mere attempt is improper. He must not think that he can somehow transfer his energy and his intelligence to them and make them fit for his purposes in that way. He must face other men as they are, recognizing them as essentially independent entities by nature and beyond his primary influence. He must deal with them only on his own independent terms, deal with such as he judges can fit his purpose or live up to his standards, by themselves and of their own will, independently of him, and expect nothing from the others. Now, in Dagny's case, her desperate desire is to run Taggart Transcontinental. She sees that there are no men suited to her purpose around her, no men of ability, independence, and competence. She thinks she can others with the incompetent and the parasites, either by training them or merely by treating them as robots who will take her orders and function without personal initiative or responsibility. With herself, in effect, being the spark of initiative, the bearer of responsibility for a whole collective. This can't be done. This is her crucial error. This is where she fails. Ayn Rand's basic purpose as a novelist was to present not villains or even heroes with errors, but the ideal man, the consistent, the fully integrated, the perfect. In Atlas Shrugged, this is John Galt, the towering figure who moves the world and the novel, yet does not appear on stage until part 3. By his nature, and that of the story, Galt is necessarily central to the lives of all the characters. In one note, Galt's relation to the others, dated June 27, 1946, Miss Rand defines succinctly what Galt represents to each of them. For Dagny, the ideal. The answer to her two quests, genius and the man she loves. The first quest is expressed in her search for the inventor of the engine. The second, her growing conviction that she will never be in love. For Reardon, the friend, the kind of understanding and appreciation he has always wanted and did not know he wanted, or he thought he had it. He tried to find it in those around him, to get it from his wife, his mother, brother, and sister. For Francisco d'Anconia, the aristocrat, the only man who represents a challenge and a stimulant. Almost the proper kind of audience, worthy of stunning for the sheer joy and color of life. For Danaskjold, the anchor. The only man who represents land and roots to a restless, reckless wanderer, like the goal of a struggle, the port at the end of a fierce sea voyage. The only man he can respect. For the composer, the inspiration and the perfect audience. For the philosopher, the embodiment of his abstractions. For Father Amadeus, the source of his conflict. The uneasy realization that Galt is the end of his endeavors, the man of virtue, the perfect man, and that his means do not fit this end, and that he is destroying this, his ideal, for the sake of those who are evil. To James Taggart, the eternal threat, the secret dread, the reproach, the guilt, his own guilt. He has no specific tie-in with Galt, but he has that constant, causeless, unnamed hysterical fear, and he recognizes it when he hears Galt's broadcast and when he sees Galt in person for the first time. To the professor, his conscience, the reproach and reminder, the ghost that haunts him through everything he does without a moment's peace, the thing that says no to his whole life. Some notes on the above. Reardon's sister Stacy was a minor character later cut from the novel. Francisco was spelled Francesco in these early years, while Danaskild's first name at this point was Ivar, presumably after Ivar Kruger, the Swedish match king, who was the real-life model of Bjorn Faulkner in Night of January 16th. Father Amadeus was Taggart's priest, to whom he confessed his sins. The priest was supposed to be a positive character, honestly devoted to the good, but practicing consistently the morality of mercy. Miss Rand dropped him, she told me, when she found that it was impossible to make such a character convincing. The professor is Robert Stadler. This brings me to a final excerpt. Because of her passion for ideas, Miss Rand was often asked whether she was primarily a philosopher or a novelist. In later years, she was impatient with this question, but she gave her own answer to and for herself in a note dated May 4th, 1946. The broader context was a discussion of the nature of creativity. I seem to be both a theoretical philosopher and a fiction writer, but it is the last that interests me most. The first is only the means to the last, the absolutely necessary means, but only the means. The fiction story is the end. Without an understanding and statement of the right philosophical principle, I cannot create the right story. But the discovery of the principle interests me only as the discovery of the proper knowledge to be used from my life purpose. And my life purpose is the creation of the kind of world, people, and events that I like. That is, that represents human perfection. Philosophical knowledge is necessary in order to define human perfection, but I do not care to stop at the definition. I want to use it, to apply it, in my work, in my personal life too, but the core, center, and purpose of my personal life, of my whole life, is my work. This is why I think the idea of writing a philosophical non-fiction book bored me. In such a book, the purpose would actually be to teach others, to present my idea to them. In a book of fiction, the purpose is to create for myself the kind of world I want and to live in it while I am creating it. Then, as a secondary consequence, to let others enjoy this world, if and to the extent that they can. It may be said that the first purpose of a philosophical book is the clarification or statement of your new knowledge to and for yourself. And then, as a secondary step, the offering of your knowledge to others. But here is the difference, as far as I'm concerned. I have to acquire and state to myself the new philosophical knowledge or principle I used in order to write a fiction story as its embodiment and illustration. I do not care to write a story on a theme or thesis of old knowledge, knowledge stated or discovered by someone else, that is, someone else's philosophy, because those philosophies are wrong. To this extent, I am an abstract philosopher. I want to present the perfect man and his perfect life. And I must also discover my own philosophical statement and definition of this perfection. But when and if I have discovered such new knowledge, I am not interested in stating it in its abstract general form, that is, as knowledge. I am interested in using it, in applying it, that is, in stating it in the concrete form of men and events, in the form of a fiction story. This last is my final purpose, my end. The philosophical knowledge or discovery is only the means to it. For my purpose, the non-fiction form of abstract knowledge doesn't interest me. The final, applied form of fiction, of story, does. I state the knowledge to myself anyway, but I choose the final form of it, the expression in the completed cycle that leads back to man. I wonder to what extent I represent a peculiar phenomenon in this respect. I think I represent the proper integration of a complete human being. Anyway, this should be my lead for the character of John Galt. He too is a combination of an abstract philosopher and a practical inventor, the thinker and the man of action together. In learning, we draw an abstraction from concrete objects and events. In creating, we make our own concrete objects and events out of the abstraction. We bring the abstraction down and back to its specific meaning, to the concrete. But the abstraction has helped us to make the kind of concrete we want the concrete to be. It has helped us to create, to reshape the world as we wish it to be for our purposes. I cannot resist quoting one further paragraph. It comes a few pages later in the same discussion. Incidentally, as a sideline observation, if creative fiction writing is a process of translating an abstraction into the concrete, there are three possible grades of such writing. Translating an old, known abstraction, theme, or thesis through the medium of old fiction means. That is, characters, events, or situations used before for that same purpose, that same translation. This is most of the popular trash. Translating an old abstraction to new original fiction means. This is most of the good literature. Creating a new original abstraction and translating it through new original means. This, as far as I know, is only me. My kind of fiction writing. May God forgive me. Metaphor, if this is mistaken conceit. As near as I can now see it, it isn't. A fourth possibility, translating a new abstraction through old means, is impossible by definition. If the abstraction is new, there can be no means used by anybody else before to translate it. Is her conclusion mistaken conceit? It is now 45 years since she wrote this note, and you are holding Ayn Rand's masterwork in your hands. You decide. Leonard Peikoff, September 1991. Part 1.
Flora.
Non-contradiction. Chapter 1. The theme. Who is John Galt? The light was ebbing, and Eddie Willers could not distinguish the bum's face. The bum had said it simply, without expression. But from the sunset far at the end of the street, yellow glints caught his eyes, and the eyes looked straight at Eddie Willers, mocking and still, as if the question had been addressed to the causeless uneasiness within him. "Why did you say that?" asked Eddie Willers, his voice tense. The bum leaned against the side of the doorway. A wedge of broken glass behind him reflected the metal yellow of the sky. "Why does it bother you?" he asked. "It doesn't," snapped Eddie Willers. He reached hastily into his pocket. The bum had stopped him and asked for a dime, then had gone on talking, as if to kill that moment and postpone the problem of the next. Pleas for dimes were so frequent in the streets these days that it was not necessary to listen to explanations, and he had no desire to hear the details of this bum's particular despair. "Go get your cup of coffee," he said, handing the dime to the shadow that had no face. "Thank you, sir," said the voice, without interest, and the face leaned forward for a moment. The face was wind-browned, cut by lines of weariness and cynical resignation. The eyes were intelligent. Eddie Willers walked on, wondering why he always felt it at this time. This sense of dread without reason. No, he thought, not dread. There's nothing to fear. Just an immense, diffused apprehension with no source or object. He had become accustomed to the feeling, but he could find no explanation for it. Yet the bum had spoken as if he knew that Eddie felt it, as if he thought that one should feel it, and more, as if he knew the reason. Eddie Willers pulled his shoulders straight in conscientious self-discipline. He had to stop this, he thought. He was beginning to imagine things. Had he always felt it? He was 32 years old. He tried to think back. No, he hadn't. But he could not remember when it had started. The feeling came to him suddenly, at random intervals, and now it was coming more often than ever. It's the twilight, he thought. I hate the twilight. The clouds and the shafts of skyscrapers against them were turning brown, like an old painting in oil, the color of a fading masterpiece. Long streaks of grime ran from under the pinnacles down the slender, soot-eaten walls. High on the side of a tower, there was a crack in the shape of a motionless lightning, the length of 10 stories. A jagged object cut the sky above the roofs. It was half a spire, still holding the glow of the sunset. The gold leaf had long since peeled off the other half. The glow was red and still, like the reflection of a fire. Not an active fire, but a dying one, which it is too late to stop. No, thought Eddie Willers, there was nothing disturbing in the sight of the city. It looked as it had always looked. He walked on, reminding himself that he was late in returning to the office. He did not like the task which he had to perform on his return, but it had to be done. So he did not attempt to delay it, but made himself walk faster. He turned a corner. In the narrow space between the dark silhouettes of 2 buildings, as in the crack of a door, he saw the page of a gigantic calendar suspended in the sky. It was the calendar that the mayor of New York had erected last year on the top of a building, so that citizens might tell the day of the month as they told the hours of the day, by glancing up at a public tower. A white rectangle hung over the city, imparting the date to the men in the streets below. In the rusty light of this evening's sunset, the rectangle said, September 2nd. Eddie Willers looked away. He had never liked the sight of that calendar. It disturbed him, in a manner he could not explain or define. The feeling seemed to blend with his sense of uneasiness. It had the same quality. He thought suddenly that there was some phrase, a kind of quotation that expressed what the calendar seemed to suggest. But he could not recall it. He walked, groping for a sentence that hung in his mind as an empty shape. He could neither fill it nor dismiss it. He glanced back. The white rectangle stood above the roofs, saying in immovable finality, September 2nd. Eddie Willers shifted his glance down to the street, to a vegetable pushcart at the stoop of a brown house. He saw a pile of bright gold carrots and the fresh green of onions. He saw a clean white curtain blowing out an open window. He saw a bus turning a corner, expertly steered. He wondered why he felt reassured, and then why he felt the sudden, inexplicable wish that these things were not left in the open, unprotected against the empty space above. When he came to Fifth Avenue, he kept his eyes on the windows of the stores he passed. There was nothing he needed or wished to buy, but he liked to see the display of goods, any goods, objects made by men to be used by men. He enjoyed the sight of a prosperous street. Not more than every 4th one of the stores was out of business, its windows dark and empty. He did not know why he suddenly thought of the oak tree. Nothing had recalled it, but he thought of it, and of his childhood summers on the Taggart estate. He had spent most of his childhood with the Taggart children, and now he worked for them, as his father and grandfather had worked for their father and grandfather. The great oak tree had stood on a hill over the Hudson in a lonely spot of the Taggart estate. Eddie Willers, aged 7, liked to come and look at that tree. It had stood there for hundreds of years, and he thought it would always stand there. Its roots clutched the hill like a fist with fingers sunk into the soil, and he thought that if a giant were to seize it by the top, he would not be able to uproot it, but would swing the hill and the whole of the earth with it, like a ball at the end of a string. He felt safe in the oak tree's presence. It was a thing that nothing could change or threaten. It was his greatest symbol of strength. One night, lightning struck the oak tree. Eddie saw it the next morning. It lay broken in half, and he looked into its trunk as into the mouth of a black tunnel. The trunk was only an empty shell. Its heart had rotted away long ago. There was nothing inside, just a thin gray dust that was being dispersed by the whim of the faintest wind. The living power had gone, and the shape it left had not been able to stand without it. Years later, he heard it said that children should be protected from shock, from their first knowledge of death, pain, or fear. But these had never scarred him. His shock came when he stood very quietly, looking into the black hole of the trunk. It was an immense betrayal. The more terrible because he could not grasp what it was that had been betrayed. It was not himself, he knew, nor his trust. It was something else. He stood there for a while, making no sound. Then he walked back to the house. He never spoke about it to anyone, then or since. Eddie Willers shook his head as the screech of a rusty mechanism changing a traffic light stopped him on the edge of a curb. He felt anger at himself. There was no reason that he had to remember the oak tree tonight. It meant nothing to him any longer, only a faint tinge of sadness. And somewhere within him, a drop of pain moving briefly and vanishing, like a raindrop on the glass of a window, its course in the shape of a question mark. He wanted no sadness attached to his childhood. He loved its memories. Any day of it he remembered now seemed flooded by a still, brilliant sunlight. It seemed to him as if a few rays from it reached into his present. Not rays, more like pinpoint spotlights that gave an occasional moment's glitter to his job, to his lonely apartment, to the quiet, scrupulous progression of his existence. He thought of a summer day when he was 10 years old. That day, in a clearing of the woods, the one precious companion of his childhood told him what they would do when they grew up. The words were harsh and glowing, like the sunlight. He listened in admiration and in wonder. When he was asked what he would want to do, he answered at once, "Whatever is right," and added, "You ought to do something great. I mean, the two of us together." "What?" she asked. He said, "I don't know. That's what we ought to find out. Not just what you said, not just business and earning a living. Things like winning battles or saving people out of fires or climbing mountains." "What for?" she asked. He said, "The minister said last Sunday that we must always reach for the best within us." "What do you suppose is the best within us?" "I don't know." "We'll have to find out." She did not answer. She was looking away, up the railroad track. Eddie Willers smiled. He had said, "Whatever is right," 22 years ago. He had kept that statement unchallenged ever since. The other questions had faded in his mind. He had been too busy to ask them. But he still thought it self-evident that one had to do what was right. He had never learned how people could want to do otherwise. He had learned only that they did. It still seemed simple and incomprehensible to him. Simple that things should be right, and incomprehensible that they weren't. He knew that they weren't. He thought of that as he turned a corner and came to the great building of Taggart Transcontinental. The building stood over the street as its tallest and proudest structure. Eddie Willers always smiled at his first sight of it. Its long bands of windows were unbroken, in contrast to those of its neighbors. Its rising lines cut the sky, with no crumbling corners or worn edges. It seemed to stand above the years, untouched. It would always stand there, thought Eddie Willers. Whenever he entered the Taggart building, he felt relief and a sense of security. This was a place of competence and power. The floors of its hallways were mirrors made of marble. The frosted rectangles of its electric fixtures were chips of solid light. Behind sheets of glass, rows of girls sat at typewriters, the clicking of their keys like the sound of speeding train wheels. And like an answering echo, a faint shudder went through the walls at times, rising from under the building, from the tunnels of the great terminal where trains started out to cross a continent and stopped after crossing it again, as they had started and stopped for generation after generation. Taggart Transcontinental, thought Eddie Willers, from ocean to ocean. The proud slogan of his childhood, so much more shining and holy than any commandment of the Bible. From ocean to ocean, forever, thought Eddie Willers, in the manner of a rededication, as he walked through the spotless halls into the heart of the building, into the office of James Taggart, president of Taggart Transcontinental. James Taggart sat at his desk. He looked like a man approaching 50 who had crossed into age from adolescence without the intermediate stage of youth. He had a small, petulant mouth and thin hair clinging to a bald forehead. His posture had a limp, decentralized sloppiness, as if in defiance of his tall, slender body, a body with an elegance of line intended for the confident poise of an aristocrat, but transformed into the gawkiness of a lout. The flesh of his face was pale and soft. His eyes were pale and veiled, with a glance that moved slowly, never quite stopping, gliding off and past things in eternal resentment of their existence. He looked obstinate and drained. He was 39 years old. He lifted his head with irritation at the sound of the opening door. "Don't bother me, don't bother me, don't bother me," said James Taggart. Eddie Willers walked toward the desk. "It's important, Jim," he said, not raising his voice. All right. What is it?" Eddie Willers looked at a map on the wall of the office. The map's colors had faded under the glass. He wondered dimly how many Taggart presidents had sat before it and for how many years. The Taggart Transcontinental Railroad, the network of red lines slashing the faded body of the country from New York to San Francisco, looked like a system of blood vessels. It looked as if once, long ago, the blood had shot down the main artery and, under the pressure of its own overabundance, had branched out at random points, running all over the country. One red streak twisted its way from Cheyenne, Wyoming, down to El Paso, Texas, the Rio Norte line of Taggart Transcontinental. New tracing had been added recently, and the red streak had been extended south beyond El Paso. But Eddie Willers turned away hastily when his eyes reached that point. He looked at James Taggart and said, "It's the Rio Norte line." He noticed Taggart's glance moving down to a corner of the desk. "We've had another wreck. Railroad accidents happen every day. Did you have to bother me about that?" "You know what I'm saying, Jim. The Rio Norte is done for. That track is shot, down the whole line. We are getting a new track." Eddie Willers continued as if there had been no answer. "That track is shot. It's no use trying to run trains down there. People are giving up trying to use them. There is not a railroad in the country, it seems to me, that doesn't have a few branches running at a deficit. We're not the only ones. It's a national condition, a temporary national condition." Eddie stood looking at him silently. What Taggart disliked about Eddie Willers was this habit of looking straight into people's eyes. Eddie's eyes were blue, wide, and questioning. He had blonde hair and a square face, unremarkable except for that look of scrupulous attentiveness and open wonder. "What do you want?" snapped Taggart. "I just came to tell you something you had to know, because somebody had to tell you. That we've had another accident? That we can't give up the Rio Norte line." James Taggart seldom raised his head. When he looked at people, he did so by lifting his heavy eyelids and staring upward from under the expanse of his bald forehead. "Who's thinking of giving up the Rio Norte line?" he asked. "There's never been any question of giving it up. I resent your saying it. I resent it very much. But we haven't met a schedule for the last 6 months. We haven't completed a run without some sort of breakdown, major or minor. We're losing all our shippers, one after another. How long can we last?" "You're a pessimist, Eddie. You lack faith. That's what undermines the morale of an organization." "You mean that nothing's going to be done about the Rio Norte line?" "I haven't said that at all. Just as soon as we get the new track." "Jim, there isn't going to be any new track." He watched Taggart's eyelids move up slowly. "I've just come back from the office of Association. I've spoken to Orrin Boyle." "What did he say?" "He spoke for an hour and did not give me a single straight answer." "What did you bother him for?" "I believe the first order of rail wasn't due for delivery until next month. And before that, it was due for delivery 3 months ago. Unforeseen circumstances. Absolutely beyond Orrin's control. And before that, it was due 6 months earlier. Jim, we have waited for Associated Steel to deliver that rail for 13 months. What do you want me to do? I can't run Orrin Boyle's business. I want you to understand that we can't..." Taggart asked slowly, his voice half mocking, half cautious. "What did my sister say?" "She won't be back until tomorrow." "Well, what do you want me to do?" "That's for you to decide." "Well, whatever else you say, there's one thing you're not going to mention next. And that's Reardon Steel." Eddie did not answer at once, then said quietly, "All right, Jim. I won't mention it." "Orrin is my friend." He heard no answer. "I resent your attitude. Orrin Boyle will deliver that rail just as soon as it's humanly possible. So long as he can't deliver it, nobody can blame us." "Jim, what are you talking about? Don't you understand? The Rio Norte line is breaking up, whether anybody blames us or not." "People would put up with it. They'd have to, if it weren't for the Phoenix Durango." He saw Eddie's face tighten. Nobody ever complained about the Rio Norte line until the Phoenix Durango came on the scene. The Phoenix Durango is doing a brilliant job. Imagine a thing called the Phoenix Durango competing with Taggart Transcontinental. It was nothing but a local milk line 10 years ago. It's got most of the freight traffic of Arizona, New Mexico, and Colorado now. Taggart did not answer. "Jim, we can't lose Colorado. It's our last hope. It's everybody's last hope. If we don't pull ourselves together, we'll lose every big shipper in the state to the Phoenix Durango. We've lost the Wyatt oil fields." "I don't see why everybody keeps talking about the Wyatt oil fields." "Because Ellis Wyatt is a prodigy who..." "Damn Ellis Wyatt. Those oil wells," Eddie thought suddenly. Didn't they have something in common with the blood vessels on the map? Wasn't that the way the red stream of Taggart Transcontinental had shot across the country years ago? A feat that seemed incredible now? He thought of the oil wells spouting a black stream that ran over a continent almost faster than the trains of the Phoenix Durango could carry it. That oil field had been only a rocky patch in the mountains of Colorado, given up as exhausted long ago. Ellis Wyatt's father had managed to squeeze an obscure living to the end of his days out of the dying oil wells. Now it was as if somebody had given a shot of adrenaline to the heart of the mountain. The heart had started pumping, the black blood had burst through the rocks. Of course it's blood, thought Eddie Willers, because blood is supposed to feed, to give life, and that is what Wyatt Oil had done. It had shocked empty slopes of ground into sudden existence. It had brought new towns, new power plants, new factories to a region nobody had ever noticed on any map. New factories, thought Eddie Willers, at a time when the freight revenues from all the great oil industries were dropping slowly year by year. A rich, new oil field at a time when the pumps were stopping in one famous field after another. A new industrial state where nobody had expected anything but cattle and beets. One man had done it, and he had done it in 8 years. This, thought Eddie Willers, was like the stories he had read in school books and never quite believed, the stories of men who had lived in the days of the country's youth. Wished he could meet Ellis Wyatt. There was a great deal of talk about him, but few had ever met him. He seldom came to New York. They said he was 33 years old and had a violent temper. He had discovered some way to revive exhausted oil wells, and he had proceeded to revive them. Ellis Wyatt is a greedy bastard who's after nothing but money, said James Taggart. It seems to me that there are more important things in life than making money. What are you talking about, Jim? What has that got to do with... Besides, he's double-crossed us. We served the Wyatt oil fields for years, most adequately. In the days of Old Man Wyatt, we ran a tank train a week. These are not the days of Old Man Wyatt, Jim. The Phoenix Durango runs 2 tank trains a day down there, and it runs them on schedule. If he had given us time to grow along with him. He has no time to waste. What does he expect? That we drop all our other shippers, sacrifice the interests of the whole country, and give him all our trains? Why, no. He doesn't expect anything. He just deals with the Phoenix Durango. I think he's a destructive, unscrupulous ruffian. I think he's an irresponsible upstart who's been grossly overrated. It was astonishing to hear a sudden emotion in James Taggart's lifeless voice. I'm not so sure that his oil fields are such a beneficial achievement. It seems to me that he's dislocated the economy of the whole country. Nobody expected Colorado to become an industrial state. How can we have any security or plan anything if everything changes all the time? Good God, Jim. Yes, I know. He's making money. But that is not the standard, it seems to me, by which one gauges a man's value to society. His oil, he'd come crawling to us, and he'd wait his turn along with all the other shippers, and he wouldn't demand more than his fair share of transportation, if it weren't for the Phoenix. We can't help it if we're up against destructive competition of that kind. Nobody can blame us. The pressure in his chest and temples, thought Eddie Willers, was the strain of the effort he was making. He had decided to make the issue clear for once, and the issue was so clear, he thought, that nothing could bar it from Taggart's, unless it was the failure of his own presentation. So he had tried hard, but he was failing, just as he had always failed in all of their discussions. No matter what he said, they never seemed about the same subject. Jim, what are you saying? Does it matter that nobody blames us when the road is falling apart? James Taggart smiled. It was a thin smile, amused and cold. It's touching, Eddie, he said. It's touching. Your devotion to Taggart Transcontinental. If you don't look out, you'll turn into one of those real feudal serfs. That's what I am, Jim. But may I ask whether it is your job to discuss these matters with me? No, it isn't. Then why don't you learn that we have departments to take care of things? Why don't you report all this to whoever's concerned? Why don't you cry on my dear sister's shoulder? Look, Jim, I know it's not my place to talk to you, but I can't understand what's going on. I don't know what it is that your proper advisors tell you or why they can't make you understand. So I thought I'd try to tell you myself. I appreciate our childhood friendship, Eddie, but do you think that that should entitle you to walk in here unannounced whenever you wish? Considering your own rank, shouldn't you remember that I am president of Taggart Transcontinental? This was wasted. Eddie Willers looked at him as usual, not hurt, merely puzzled, and asked, "Then you don't intend to do anything about the Rio Norte line?" "I haven't said that. I haven't said that at all." Taggart was looking at the map, at the red streak south of El Paso. "Just as soon as the San Sebastian mines get going and our Mexican branch begins to pay off." Let's talk about that, Jim." Taggart turned, startled by the unprecedented phenomenon of an implacable anger in Eddie's voice. "What's the matter?" "You know what's the matter. Your sister said—" "Damn my sister," said James Taggart. Eddie Willers did not move. He did not answer. He stood looking straight ahead, but he did not see James Taggart or anything in the office. After a moment, he bowed and walked out. In the anteroom, the clerks of James Taggart's personal staff were switching off the lights, getting ready to leave for the day. But Pop Harper, chief clerk, still sat at his desk, twisting the levers of a half-dismembered typewriter. Everybody in the company had the impression that Pop Harper was born in that particular corner at that particular desk and never intended to leave it. He had been chief clerk for James Taggart's father. Pop Harper glanced up at Eddie Willers as he came out of the president's office. It was a wise, slow glance. It seemed to say that he knew that Eddie's visit to their part of the building meant trouble on the line, knew that nothing had come of the visit, and was completely indifferent to the knowledge. It was the cynical indifference which Eddie Willers had seen in the eyes of the bum on the street. "Say, Eddie, know where I could get some woolen undershirts?" he asked. "Tried all over town, but nobody's got them." "I don't know," said Eddie, stopping. "Why do you ask me?" "I just ask everybody. Maybe somebody'll tell me." Eddie looked uneasily at the blank, emaciated face and white hair. "It's cold in this joint," said Pop Harper. "It's going to be colder this winter." "What are you doing?" Eddie asked, pointing at the pieces of typewriter. "The damn thing's busted again. No use sending it out. Took them 3 months to fix it the last time. Thought I'd patch it up myself. Not for long, I guess." He let his fist drop down on the keys. "You're ready for the junk pile, old pal. Your days are numbered." Eddie started. That was the sentence he had tried to remember. Your days are numbered. But he had forgotten in what connection he had tried to remember it. "It's no use, Eddie," said Pop Harper. "What's no use?" "Nothing. Anything." "What's the matter, Pop?" "I'm not going to requisition a new typewriter. The new ones are made of tin. When the old ones go, that will be the end of typewriting. There was an accident in the subway this morning. The brakes wouldn't work. You ought to go home, Eddie. Turn on the radio and listen to a good dance band. Forget it, boy. Trouble with you is you never had a hobby. Somebody stole the electric light bulbs again from off the staircase down where I live. I've got a pain in my chest. Couldn't get any cough drops this morning. The drugstore on our corner went bankrupt last week. The Texas Western Railroad went bankrupt last month. They closed the Queensboro Bridge yesterday for temporary repairs. Well, what's the use? Who is John Galt?" She sat at the window of the train, her head thrown back, one leg stretched across to the empty seat before her. window frame trembled with the speed of the motion. The pane hung over empty darkness, and dots of light slashed across the glass as luminous streaks once in a while. Her leg, sculptured by the tight sheen of the stocking, its long line running straight over an arched instep to the tip of a foot in a high-heeled pump, had a feminine elegance that seemed out of place in the dusty train car, and oddly incongruous with the rest of her. She wore a battered camel's hair coat that had been expensive, wrapped shapelessly about her slender, nervous body. The coat collar was raised to the slanting brim of her hat. A sweep of brown hair fell back, almost touching the line of her shoulders. Her face was made of angular planes, the shape of her mouth clear-cut, a sensual mouth held closed with inflexible precision. She kept her hands in the coat pockets, her posture taut, as if she resented immobility, and unfeminine, as if she were unconscious of her own body, and that it was a woman's body. She sat listening to the music. It was a symphony of triumph. The notes flowed up. They spoke of rising, and they were the rising itself. They were the essence and the form of upward motion. They seemed to embody every human act and thought that had ascent as its motive. It was a sunburst of sound, breaking out of hiding and spreading open. It had the freedom of release and the tension of purpose. It swept space clean and left nothing but the joy of an unobstructed effort. Only a faint echo within the sounds spoke of that from which the music had escaped, but spoke in laughing astonishment at the discovery that there was no ugliness or pain, and there never had had to be. It was the song of an immense deliverance. She thought, for just a few moments, while this lasts, it is all right to surrender completely, to forget everything and just permit yourself to feel. She thought, let go. Drop the controls. This is it. Somewhere on the edge of her mind, under the music, she heard the sound of train wheels. They knocked in an even rhythm, every fourth knock accented, as if stressing a conscious purpose. She could relax because she heard the wheels. She listened to the symphony, thinking, this is why the wheels have to be kept going. And this is where they're going. She had never heard that symphony before, but she knew that it was written by Richard Halley. She recognized the violence and the magnificent intensity. She recognized the style of the theme. It was a clear, complex melody, at a time when no one wrote melody any longer. She sat looking up at the ceiling of the car, but she did not see it, and she had forgotten where she was. She did not know whether she was hearing a full symphony orchestra or only the theme. Perhaps she was hearing the orchestration in her own mind. She thought dimly that there had been premonitory echoes of this theme in all of Richard Halley's work, through all the years of his long struggle, to the day, in his middle age, when fame struck him suddenly and knocked him out. This, she thought, listening to the symphony, had been the goal of his struggle. She remembered half-hinted attempts in his music, phrases that promised it, broken bits of melody that started but never quite reached it. When Richard Halley wrote this, She sat up straight. When did Richard Halley write this? In the same instant, she realized where she was and wondered for the first time where that came from. A few steps away, at the end of the car, a brakeman was adjusting the controls of the air conditioner. He was blond and young. He was whistling the theme of the symphony. She realized that he had been whistling it for some time, and that this was all she had heard. She watched him incredulously for a while before she raised her voice to ask, "Tell me, please, what are you whistling?" The boy turned to her. She met a direct glance and saw an open, eager smile, as if he were sharing a confidence with a friend. She liked his face. Its lines were tight and firm. It did not have that look of loose muscles evading the responsibility of a shape, which she had learned to expect in people's faces. "It's the Halley Concerto," he answered, smiling. "Which one?" "The fifth." She let a moment pass before she said slowly and very carefully, "Richard Halley wrote only 4 concertos." The boy boy's smile vanished. It was as if he were jolted back to reality, just as she had been a few moments ago. It was as if a shutter were slammed down, and what remained was a face without expression, impersonal, indifferent, and empty. Yes, of course, he said. I'm wrong. I made a mistake. Then what was it? Something I heard somewhere. What? I don't know. Where did you hear it? I don't remember. She paused helplessly. He was turning away from her without further interest. It sounded like a Halley theme, she said. But I know every note he's ever written, and he never wrote that. There was still no expression, only a faint look of attentiveness on the boy's face as he turned back to her and asked, You like the music of Richard Halley? Yes, she said. I like it very much. He considered her for a moment, as if hesitating. Then he turned away. She watched the expert efficiency of his movements as he went on working. He worked in silence. She had not slept for 2 nights, but she could not permit herself to sleep. She had too many problems to consider and not much time. The train was due in New York early in the morning. She needed the time, yet she wished the train would go faster. But it was the Taggart Comet, the fastest train in the country. She tried to think, but the music remained on the edge of her mind, and she kept hearing it in full chords, like the implacable steps of something that could not be stopped. She shook her head angrily, jerked her hat off, and lighted a cigarette. She would not sleep, she thought. She could last until tomorrow night. The train wheels clicked in accented rhythm. She was so used to them that she did not hear them consciously, but the sound became a sense of peace within her. When she extinguished her cigarette, she knew that she needed another one, but thought that she would give herself a minute, just a few minutes, before she would light it. She had fallen asleep, and she awakened with a jolt, knowing that something was wrong, before she knew what it was. The wheels had stopped. The car stood soundless and dim in the blue glow of the night lamps. She glanced at her watch. There was no reason for stopping. She looked out the window. The train stood still in the middle of empty fields. She heard someone moving in a seat across the aisle and asked, How long have we been standing? A man's voice answered indifferently, About an hour. The man looked after her, sleepily astonished, because she leaped to her feet and rushed to the door. There was a cold wind outside, and an empty stretch of land under an empty sky. She heard weeds rustling in the darkness. Far ahead she saw the figures of men standing by the engine, and above them, hanging detached in the sky, the red light of a signal. She walked rapidly toward them, past the motionless line of wheels. No one paid attention to her when she approached. The train crew and a few passengers stood clustered under the red light. They had stopped talking. They seemed to be waiting in placid indifference. What's the matter? She asked. The engineer turned, astonished. Her question had sounded like an order, not like the amateur curiosity of a passenger. She stood, hands in pockets, coat collar raised, the wind beating her hair in strands across her face. Red light, lady, he said, pointing up with his thumb. How long has it been on? An hour. We're off the main track, aren't we? That's right. Why? I don't know. The conductor spoke up. I don't think we had any business being sent off on a siding. That switch wasn't working right, and this thing's not working at all. He jerked his head up at the red light. I don't think the signal's going to change. I think it's busted. Then what are you doing? Waiting for it to change. In her pause of startled anger, the fireman chuckled. Last week, the crack special of the Atlantic Southern got left on the siding for 2 hours. Just somebody's mistake. This is the Taggart Comet, she said. The Comet has never been late. She's the only one in the country that hasn't, said the engineer. There's always a first time, said the fireman. You don't know about railroads, lady, said a passenger. There's not a signal system or a dispatcher in the country that's worth a damn. She did not turn or notice him, but spoke to the engineer. "If you know that the signal is broken, what do you intend to do?" He did not like her tone of authority, and he could not understand why she assumed it so naturally. She looked like a young girl. Only her mouth and eyes showed that she was a woman in her 30s. The dark gray eyes were direct and disturbing, as if they cut through things, throwing the inconsequential out of the way. The face seemed faintly familiar to him, but he could not recall where he had seen it. "Lady, I don't intend to stick my neck out," he said. "He means," said the fireman, "that our job's to wait for orders. Your job is to run this train. Not against a red light. If the light says stop, we stop." "A red light means danger, lady," said the passenger. "We're not taking any chances," said the engineer. "Whoever's responsible for it, he'll switch the blame to us if we move, so we're not moving till somebody tells us to. And if nobody does, somebody will turn up sooner or later. How long do you propose to wait?" The engineer shrugged. "Who is John Galt?" "He means," said the fireman, "don't ask questions nobody can answer." She looked at the red light and at the rail that went off into the black, untouched distance. She said, "Proceed with caution to the next signal. If it's in order, proceed to the main track. Then stop at the first open office." "Yeah? Who says so?" "I do." "Who are you?" It was only the briefest pause, a moment of astonishment at a question she had not expected, but the engineer looked more closely at her face, and in time with her answer he gasped, "Good God!" She answered, not offensively, merely like a person who does not hear the question often, "Dagny Taggart." "Well, I'll be," said the fireman, and then they all remained silent. She went on in the same tone of unstressed authority. "Proceed to the main track and hold the train for me at the first open office." "Yes, Miss Taggart." "You'll have to make up time. You've got the rest of the night to do it. Get the Comet in on schedule." "Yes, Miss Taggart." She was turning to go when the engineer asked, "If there's any trouble, are you taking the responsibility for it, Miss Taggart?" "I am." The conductor followed her as she walked back to her car. He was saying, bewildered, "But just a seat in a day coach, Miss Taggart? But how come? But why didn't you let us know?" She smiled easily. "Had no time to be formal. Had my own car attached to number 22 out of Chicago, but got off at Cleveland. And number 22 was running late, so I let the car go. The Comet came next, and I took it. There was no sleeping car space left." The conductor shook his head. "Your brother? He wouldn't have taken a coach." She laughed. "No, he wouldn't have." The men by the engine watched her walking away. The young brakeman was among them. He asked, pointing after her, "Who is that?" "That's who runs Taggart Transcontinental," said the engineer. The respect in his voice was genuine. "That's the vice president in charge of operation." When the train jolted forward, the blast of its whistle dying over the fields, she sat by the window, lighting another cigarette. She thought, "It's cracking to pieces, like this all over the country. You can expect it anywhere at any moment." But she felt no anger or anxiety. She had no time to feel. This would be just one more issue to be settled along with the others. She knew that the superintendent of the Ohio division was no good and that he was a friend of James Taggart. She had not insisted on throwing him out long ago only because she had no better man to put in his place. Good men were so strangely hard to find. But she would have to get rid of him, she thought, and she would give his post to Owen Kellogg, the young engineer who was doing a brilliant job as one of the assistants to the manager of the Taggart terminal in New York. It was Owen Kellogg who ran the terminal. She had watched his work for some time. She had always looked for sparks of competence, like a diamond prospector in an unpromising wasteland. Kellogg was still too young to be made superintendent of a division. She had wanted to give him another year, but there was no time to wait. She would have to speak to him as soon as she returned. The strip of earth, faintly visible outside the window, was running faster now, blending into a gray stream. Through the dry phrases of calculations in her mind, she noticed that she did have time to feel something. It was the hard, exhilarating pleasure of action. With the first whistling rush of air as the comet plunged into the tunnels of the Taggart terminal under the city of New York, Dagny Taggart sat up straight. She always felt it when the train went underground, this sense of eagerness, of hope, and of secret excitement. It was as if normal existence were a photograph of shapeless things in badly printed colors, but this was a sketch done in a few sharp strokes that made things seem clean, important, and worth doing. She watched the tunnels as they flowed past. Bare walls of concrete, a net of pipes and wires, a web of rails that went off into black holes where green and red lights hung as distant drops of color. There was nothing else, nothing to dilute it, so that one could admire naked purpose and the ingenuity that had achieved it. She thought of the Taggart building standing above her head at this moment, growing straight to the sky, and she thought, these are the roots of the building, hollow roots, twisting under the ground, feeding the city. When the train stopped, when she got off and heard the concrete of the platform under her heels, she felt light, lifted, impelled to action. She started off, walking fast, as if the speed of her steps could give form to the things she felt. It was a few moments before she realized that she was whistling a piece of music, and that it was the theme of Halley's Fifth Concerto. She looking at her and turned. The young brakeman stood watching her tensely. This book is continued on Disc 2. Atlas Shrugged by Ayn Rand continued. Disc 2. She sat on the arm of the big chair facing James Taggart's desk, her coat thrown open over a wrinkled traveling suit. Eddie Willers sat across the room, making notes once in a while. His title was that of Special Assistant to the Vice President in charge of operation, and his main duty was to be her bodyguard against any waste of time. She asked him to be present at interviews of this nature, because then she never had to explain anything to him afterwards. James Taggart sat at his head drawn into his shoulders. The Rio Norte line is a pile of junk from one end to the other, she said. It's much worse than I thought, but we're going to save it. Of course, said James Taggart. Some of the rail can be salvaged. Not much, and not for long. We'll start laying new rail in the mountain sections, Colorado first. We'll get the new rail in 2 months. Oh, did Orrin Boyle say he'll... I've ordered the rail from Reardon Steel. The slight, choked sound from Eddie Willers was his suppressed desire to cheer. James Taggart did not answer at once. Dagny, why don't you sit in the chair as one is supposed to? He said at last. His voice was petulant. Nobody holds business conferences this way. I do. She waited. He asked, his eyes avoiding hers, did you say that you have ordered the rail from Reardon? Yesterday evening. I phoned him from Cleveland. But the board hasn't authorized it. I haven't authorized it. You haven't consulted me. She reached over, picked up the receiver of a telephone on his desk, and handed it to him. Call Reardon and cancel it, she said. James Taggart moved back in his chair. I haven't said that, he answered angrily. I haven't said that at all. Then it stands. I haven't said that either. She turned. Eddie, have them draw up the contract with Reardon Steel. Jim will sign it. She took a crumpled piece of notepaper from her pocket and tossed it to Eddie. There's the figures and terms. Taggart said, but the board hasn't anything to do with it. They authorized you to buy the rail 13 months ago. Where you buy it is up to you. I don't think it's proper to make such a decision without giving the board a chance to express an opinion. And I don't see why I should be made to take the responsibility. I am taking it. What about the expenditure, which Reardon is charging less than Orrin Boyle's Associated Steel? Yes? And what about Orrin Boyle? I've canceled the contract. We had the right to cancel it 6 months ago. When did you do that? Yesterday. But he hasn't called to have me confirm it. He won't. Taggart sat looking down at his desk. She wondered why he resented the necessity of dealing with Reardon, and why his resentment had such an odd, evasive quality. Reardon Steel had been the chief supplier of Taggart Transcontinental for 10 years, ever since the first Reardon furnace was fired in the days when their father was president of the railroad. For 10 years, most of their rail had come from Reardon Steel. There were not many firms in the country who delivered what was ordered, when, and as ordered. Reardon Steel was one of them. If she were insane, thought Dagny, she would conclude that her brother hated to deal with Reardon because Reardon did his job with superlative efficiency. But she would not conclude it, because she thought that such a feeling was not within the humanly possible. It isn't fair, said James Taggart. What isn't? That we always give our business to Reardon. It seems to me we should give somebody else a chance too. Reardon doesn't need us. He's plenty big enough. We ought to help the smaller fellows to develop. Otherwise, we're just encouraging a monopoly. Don't talk tripe, Jim. Why do we always have to get things from Reardon? Because we always get them. I don't like Henry Reardon. I do. But what does that matter one way or the other? We need rails, and he's the only one who can give them to us. The human element is very important. You have no sense of the human element at all. We're talking about saving a railroad, Jim. Yes, of course. But still, you haven't any sense of the human element. No, I haven't. If we give Reardon such a large order for steel rails, they're not going to be steel. They're Reardon metal. She had always avoided personal reactions, but she was forced to break her rule when she saw the expression on Taggart's face. She burst out laughing. Reardon metal was a new alloy, produced by Reardon after 10 years of experiments. He had placed it on the market recently. He had received no orders and had found no customers. Taggart could not understand the transition from the laughter to the sudden tone of Dagny's voice. The voice was cold and harsh. Drop it, Jim. I know everything you're going to say. Nobody's ever used it before. Nobody approves of Reardon metal. Nobody's interested in it. Nobody wants it. Still, our rails are going to be made of Reardon metal. But, said Taggart, but nobody's ever used it before. He observed with satisfaction that she was silenced by anger. He liked to observe emotions. They were like red lanterns strung along the dark unknown of another's personality, marking vulnerable points. But how one could feel a personal emotion about a metal alloy, and what such an emotion indicated, was incomprehensible to him. So he could make no use of his discovery. The consensus of the best metallurgical authorities, he said, seems to be highly skeptical about Reardon metal, contending, drop it, Jim. Well, whose opinion did you take? I don't ask for opinions. What do you go by? Judgment. Well, whose judgment did you take? Mine. But whom did you consult about it? Nobody. Then what on earth do you know about Reardon metal? That it's the greatest thing ever put on the market. Why? Because it's tougher than steel, cheaper than steel, and will outlast any hunk of metal in existence. But who says so? Jim, I studied engineering in college. When I see things, I see them. What did you see? Reardon's formula and the tests he showed me. Well, if it were any good, somebody would have used it, and nobody has. He saw the flash of anger and went on nervously. How can you know it's good? How can you be sure? How can you decide? Somebody decides such things, Jim. Who? Well, I don't see why we have to be the first ones. I don't see it at all. Do you want to save the Rio Norte line or not? He did not answer. If the road could afford it, I would scrap every piece of rail over the whole system and replace it with Reardon metal. All of it needs replacing. None of it will last much longer. But we can't afford it. We have to get out of a bad hole first. Do you want us to pull through or not? We're still the best railroad in the country. The others are doing much worse. Then do you want us to remain in the hole? I haven't said that. Why do you always oversimplify things that way? And if you're worried about money, I don't see why you want to waste it on the Rio Norte line when the Phoenix Durango has robbed us of all our business down there. Why spend money when we have no protection against a competitor who'll destroy our investment? Because the Phoenix Durango is an excellent railroad, but I intend to make the Rio Norte line better than that. Because I'm going to beat the Phoenix Durango if necessary. Only it won't be necessary. Because there will be room for 2 or 3 railroads to make fortunes in Colorado. Because I'd mortgage the system to build a branch to any district around Ellis Wyatt. I'm sick of hearing about Ellis Wyatt. He did not like the way her eyes moved to look at him and remained still, looking for a moment. I don't see any need for immediate action, he said. He sounded offended. Just what do you consider so alarming in the present situation of Taggart Transcontinental? The consequences of your policies, Jim. Which policies? That 13 months experiment with Associated Steel, for one. Your Mexican catastrophe, for another. The board approved the Associated Steel contract, he said hastily. The board voted to build the San Sebastian line. See why you call it a catastrophe? Because the Mexican government is going to nationalize your line any day now. That's a lie. His voice was almost a scream. That's nothing but vicious rumors. I have it on very good inside authority that... Don't show that you're scared, Jim, she said contemptuously. He did not answer. It's no use getting panicky about it now, she said. All we can do is try to cushion the blow. It's going to be a bad blow. $40 million is a loss from which we won't recover easily. But Taggart Transcontinental has withstood many bad shocks in the past. I'll see to it that it withstands this one. I refuse to consider. I absolutely refuse to consider the possibility of the San Sebastian line being nationalized. All right. Don't consider it. She remained silent. He said defensively, I don't see why you're so eager to give a chance to Ellis Wyatt. Yet you think it's wrong to take part in developing an underprivileged country that never had a chance. Ellis Wyatt is not asking anybody to give him a chance. And I'm not in business to give chances. I'm running a railroad. That's an extremely narrow view, it seems to me. I don't see why we should want to help one man instead of a whole nation. I'm not interested in helping anybody. I want to make money. That's an impractical attitude. Selfish greed for profit is a thing of the past. It has been generally conceded that the interests of society as a whole must always be placed first in any business undertaking, which... How long do you intend to talk in order to evade the issue, Jim? What issue? The order for Reardon metal. He did not answer. He sat studying her silently. Her slender body, about to slump from exhaustion, was held erect by the straight line of the shoulders, and the shoulders were held by a conscious effort of will. Few people liked her face. The face was too cold, the eyes too intense. Nothing could ever lend her the charm of a soft focus. The beautiful legs, slanting down from the chair's arm in the center of his vision, annoyed him. They spoiled the rest of his estimate. She remained silent. He was forced to ask, "Did you decide to order it just like that on the spur of the moment? Over a telephone?" "I decided it 6 months ago. I was waiting for Hank Reardon to get ready to go into production." "Don't call him Hank Reardon. It's vulgar." "That's what everybody calls him. Don't change the subject." "Why did you have to telephone him last night?" "Couldn't reach him sooner." "Why didn't you wait until you got back to New York and..." "Because I had seen the Rio Norte line."
Oh, right here.
"Well, I need time to consider it, to place the matter before the board, to consult the best..." "There is no time." "You haven't given me a chance to form an opinion." "I don't give a damn about your opinion. I am not going to argue with you, with your board, or with your professors. You have a choice to make, and you're going to make it now. Just say yes or no." That's a preposterous, high-handed, arbitrary way of yes or no. That's the trouble with you. You always make it yes or no. Things are never absolute like that. Nothing is absolute. Metal rails are. Whether we get them or not is. She waited. He did not answer. "Well?" she asked. "Are you taking the responsibility for it?" "I am." "Go ahead," he said, and added, "but at your own risk. I won't cancel it, but I won't commit myself as to what I'll say to the board." "Say anything you wish." She rose to go. He leaned forward across the desk, reluctant to end the interview, and ended so decisively. "You realize, of course, that a lengthy procedure will be necessary to put this through," he said. The words sounded almost hopeful. "It isn't as simple as that." "Oh, sure," she said. "I'll send you a detailed report which Eddie will prepare and which you won't read. Eddie will help you put it through the works. I'm going to Philadelphia tonight to see Reardon. He and I have a lot of work to do." She added, "It's as simple as that, Jim." She had turned to go when he spoke again, and what he said seemed bewilderingly irrelevant. "That's all right for you, because you're lucky. Others can't do it." "Do what?" "Other people are human. They're sensitive. They can't devote their whole life to metals and engines. You're lucky. You've never had any feelings. You've never felt anything at all." As she looked at him, her dark gray eyes went slowly from astonishment to stillness, then to a strange expression that resembled a look of weariness, except that it seemed to reflect much more than the endurance of this one moment. "No, Jim," she said quietly. "I guess I've never felt anything at all." Eddie Willers followed her to her office. Whenever she returned, he felt as if the world became clear, simple, easy to face, and he forgot his moments of shapeless apprehension. He was the only person who found it completely natural that she should be the operating vice president of a great railroad, even though she was a woman. She had told him when he was 10 years old that she would run the railroad someday. It did not astonish him now, just as it had not astonished him that day in a clearing of the woods. When they entered her office, when he saw her sit down at the desk and glance at the memos he had left for her, he felt as he did in his car when the motor caught on and the wheels could move forward. He was about to office when he remembered a matter he had not reported. "Kellogg of the Terminal Division has asked me for an appointment to see you," he said. She looked up, astonished. "That's funny. I was going to send for him. Have him come up. I want to see him." "Eddie," she added suddenly, "before I start, tell them to get me Ayers, of the Ayers Music Publishing Company, on the phone." "The Music Publishing Company?" he repeated incredulously. "Yes. There's something I want to ask him." When the voice of Mr. Ayers, courteously eager, inquired of what service he could be to her, she asked, "Can you tell me whether Richard Halley has written a new piano concerto? The fifth." "A fifth concerto, Miss Taggart?" "Why, no. Of course he hasn't." "Are you sure?" "Quite sure, Miss Taggart. He has not written anything for 8 years." "Is he still alive?" "Why, yes. That is, I can't say for certain. He has dropped out of public life entirely, but I'm sure we would have heard of it if he had died." "If he wrote anything, would you know about it?" "Of course. We would be the first to know. We publish all of his work. But he has stopped writing." "I see. Thank you." When Owen Kellogg entered her office, she looked at him with satisfaction. She was glad to see that she had been right in her vague recollection of his appearance. His face had the same quality as that of the young brakeman on the train, the face of the kind of man with whom she could deal. "Sit down, Mr. Kellogg," she said, but he remained standing in front of her desk. "You had asked me once to let you know if I ever decided to change my employment, Miss Taggart," he said. "So I came to tell you that I am quitting." She had expected anything but that. It took her a moment before she asked quietly, "Why?" "For a personal reason." "Were you dissatisfied here?" "No." "Received a better offer?" "No." "What railroad are you going to?" "I'm not going to any railroad, Miss Taggart." "Then what job are you taking?" "I have not decided that yet." She studied him, feeling slightly uneasy. There was no hostility in his face. He looked straight at her. He answered simply, directly. He spoke like one who has nothing to hide or to show. The face was polite and empty. "Then why should you wish to quit?" "It's a personal matter." "Are you ill? Is it a question of your health?" "No." "Are you leaving the city?" "No." "Have you inherited money that permits you to retire?" "No." "Do you intend to continue working for a living?" "Yes." "But you do not wish to work for Taggart Transcontinental?" "No." "In that case, something must have happened here to cause your decision." "What?" "Nothing, Miss Taggart." "I wish you'd tell me. I have a reason for wanting to know." "Would you take my word for it, Miss Taggart?" "Yes." "No person, matter, or event connected with my job here had any bearing upon my decision." "You..." Superintendent Division. It's yours if you want. His face showed no reaction, as if the words had no more significance for him than for a savage who had never heard of railroads. "Miss Taggart," he answered. After a moment she said, her voice tight, "Write your own ticket, Kellogg. Name your price. I want you to stay. I can match anything any other railroad offers you. I'm not going to work for any other." "I thought you loved your work." This was the first sign of emotion in him, just a slight widening of his eyes and an oddly quiet emphasis in his voice when he answered, what it is that I should say in order to hold you. It had been involuntary and so obviously frank that he looked at her as if it had reached him. Perhaps I am being unfair by telling you that I'm quitting, Miss Taggart. I know that you asked me to tell you because you wanted to have a chance to make me a counteroffer. So if I came, it looks as if I'm open to a deal. But I'm not. I came only because I wanted to keep my word to you. That one break in his voice was like a sudden flash. The interest and her request had meant to him, and that his decision had not been an easy one to make. Kellogg, is there nothing I can offer you? She asked. Nothing. Nothing on earth. He turned to go. For the first time in her life, she felt helpless and beaten. She asked, not addressing him. He stopped. Smiled. He was alive for a moment, and it was the strangest she had ever seen. It held secret amusement and heartbreak and an infinite bitterness. He answered, "Who is John Galt?" The chain. It began with a few lights. As a train of the Taggart Line rolled toward Philadelphia, brilliant, scattered lights appeared in the darkness. They seemed purposeless in the empty plain, yet too powerful to... The passengers watched them without interest. The black shape of a structure came next, barely visible against the sky, then a big building close to the tracks. The building was dark, and the train lights streaked across the solid glass of its walls. An oncoming freight train hid the view, filling the windows with a rushing smear of noise. In a sudden break above the flat cars, the passengers saw distant structures under a faint reddish glow. The glow moved in irregular spasms, as if the structures were breathing. When the freight train vanished, they saw angular buildings wrapped in coils of steam. The rays of a few strong lights cut straight sheafs through the coils. The steam was red as the sky. The thing that came next did not look like a building, but like a shell of checkered, closing girders, cranes, and trusses in a solid, blinding orange spread of flame. The passengers could not grasp the complexity of what seemed to be a city stretched, active without sign of human presence. They saw towers that looked like contorted skyscrapers, bridges hanging in midair, and sudden wounds spurting fire from out of solid walls. They saw a line of glowing cylinders moving through the night. The cylinders were red-hot metal. An office building appeared close to the tracks. The big neon sign on its roof lighted the interiors of the coaches as they went by. It said, Reardon Steel. A passenger, who was a professor of economics, remarked to his companion, "Of what importance is an individual titanic collective achievements of our industrial age?" Another, who was a journalist, made a note for future use in his column. "Hank Reardon is the kind of man who sticks his name on everything he touches. You may from this form your own opinion about the character of Hank Reardon." The train was speeding on into the dark. Gasp shot to the sky from behind the long structure. Passengers paid no attention. One more heat of steel being poured was not an event they had been taught to notice. It was the first heat for the first order of Reardon metal. To the men at the tap hole of the furnace inside the mills, the first break of the liquid metal into the open came as a sensation of morning. The pouring had the pure white color of sunlight. Black coils of steam were boiling upward, streaked with red. Fountains of sparks shot in beating spasms as from broken arteries. The air seemed torn, reflecting a raging flame that was not there, red blotches whirling and running through space, as if not to be contained within a man-made structure, as if about to consume the columns, the girders, the bridges of cranes overhead. But the liquid metal aspect of violence. It was a long white curve with the texture of satin and the friendly radiance of a smile. It flowed obediently through a spout of clay with two brittle borders to restrain it. Through 20 feet of space, down into a ladle that held 200 tons. A flow of stars hung above the stream, leaping out of its placid smoothness, looking delicate as lace and innocent as children's sparklers. A closer glance could one notice that the white satin was boiling. Splashes flew out at times and fell to the ground below. They were metal, and while hitting the soil, they burst into flame. Which was to be harder than steel, running at a temperature of 4,000 degrees, to annihilate every wall of the structure and every one of the men who worked by the stream. But every inch of its course, every pound of its pressure, and the content of every molecule within it were controlled and made by a conscious intention that had worked upon it for 10 years. Swinging through the red glare kept slashing the face of a man who stood in a distant corner. He stood leaning against a column, watching. The glare cut a moment's wedge across his eyes, which had the quality of pale blue ice. Then across the black web of the column and the ash-blonde strands of his hair. Then across the belt of his trench coat and the pockets where he held his hands. His body was tall and gaunt. He has been too tall for those around him. His face was cut by prominent bones and by a few sharp lines. They were not the lines of age. He had always had them. This had made him look old at 20, now at 45. Ever since he could remember, he had been told that his face was ugly because it was and cruel because it was expressionless. He remained expressionless now as he looked at the metal. He was Hank Reardon. The metal came rising to the top of the ladle and went running over with arrogant prodigality. Then the blinding white trickles turned to glowing brown, and in one more instant they were black icicles of metal, starting to crumble off. The slag was crusting in thick brown ridges that looked like the crust of the earth. As the crust grew thicker, a few craters broke open, with the boiling within. A man came riding through the air in the cab of a crane overhead. He pulled the lever by the casual movement of one hand. Steel hooks came down on a chain, seized the ladle, lifted it smoothly like a bucket of milk, and 200 tons of metal went through space toward a row of molds waiting to be filled. Hank Reardon leaned back, closing his eyes. He felt the column trembling with the rumble of the crane. The job was done, he thought. A worker saw him and grinned in understanding, like a fellow accomplice in a great who knew why that tall, blonde figure had to be present here tonight. Reardon smiled in answer. It was the only salute he had received. Then he started back for his office. Once again a figure with an expressionless face. It was late when Hank left his office that night to walk from his mills to his house. It was a walk of some miles through empty, but he had felt like doing it without conscious reason. He walked, keeping one hand in his fingers closed about a bracelet. It was made of Reardon metal in the shape of a chain. His fingers moved, feeling its texture once in a while. It had taken 10 years to make that bracelet. 10 years, he thought, is a long time. The road was dark. Trees. Looking up, he could see a few leaves against the stars. The leaves were twisted and dry, ready to fall. There were distant lights in the windows of houses scattered through the countryside, but the lights made the road seem lonelier. He never felt loneliness except when he was happy. He turned once to look back at the red glow of the sky over the mills. He did not think of the 10 years. What remained of them tonight was only a feeling which he could not, except that it was quiet and solemn. The feeling was a sum, and he did not have to count again the parts that had gone to make it. The parts, unrecalled, were there. They were the nights spent at scorching ovens in the research laboratory of the mills. The nights spent in the workshop of his home, over sheets of paper which he filled with formulas, then tore up in angry failure. The days when the young scientists of the small staff he had chosen to assist him waited for instructions like soldiers ready for a hopeless battle, having exhausted their ingenuity, still willing but silent, with the unspoken sentence hanging in the air, "Mr. Reardon, it can't be done." The meals, interrupted and abandoned at the sudden flash of a new thought, a thought to be pursued at once, to be tested, to be worked on for months, and to be discarded as another failure. The moments from conferences, from contracts, from the duties of running the best steel mills in the country, snatched almost guiltily as for a secret love. The one held immovably across a span of years, under everything he did and everything he saw, the thought held in his mind when he looked at the buildings of a city, at the track of a railroad, at the light in the windows of a distant farmhouse, the knife in the hands of a beautiful woman cutting a piece of fruit at a metal alloy that would more than steel had ever done, a metal that would be to steel what steel had been to. The acts of self-racking when he discarded a hope or a sample, not permitting himself to know, not giving himself time to feel, driving himself through the ringing torture of not good enough, still not good enough, and going on with no motor save the conviction that it could be done. Then the day when it was done, and its result was called Reardon Metal. That had come to white heat, had melted and fused within him, and their alloy was a strange, quiet feeling that made him smile at the countryside in the darkness and wonder why happiness could hurt. After a while, he realized that he was thinking of his as if certain days of it were spread before him, demanding to be seen again. He did not want. He despised memories as a pointless indulgence. But then he understood that he thought of them tonight in honor of that piece in his pocket. Then he permitted himself to look. He saw the day when he stood on a rocky ledge and felt the thread of sweat running from his temple down his neck. He was 14 years old, and it was a day of work in the iron mines of Minnesota. He was trying to learn to breathe against the scalding pain in his chest. He stood, cursing himself, because he had made up his mind that he would not be tired. After a while, he went back to his task. He decided that pain was not a valid reason for stopping. He saw the day when he stood at the window of his office and looked at the mines. He owned them as of that morning. He was 30 years old. What had been the years between, just as pain had not mattered. He had worked in mines, in foundries, in the steel mills of the North, moving toward the purpose he had chosen. All he remembered of those jobs was that the men around him had never seemed to know what to do, while he had always known. He remembered wondering why so many iron mines were closing, just as these had been about to close until he took them over. He looked at the shelves of rock in the distance. Workers were putting up a new sign above a gate at the end of a road. Reardon Ore. He saw an even slumped across his desk in that office. It was late. He had left, so he could lie there alone, unwitnessed. He was tired. It was as if he had run a race against his own body, and all the exhaustion of years, which he had refused to acknowledge, had caught him at once and flattened him against the desktop. He felt nothing, except the desire not to move. He did not have the strength, not even to suffer. Everything there was to burn within him. He had scattered so many sparks, so many things, and he wondered whether someone could give him now the spark he needed, now when he felt unable ever to rise again. He asked him who had started him and kept him going. Then he raised his head, slowly, with the great greatest effort of his life, he made his body rise until he was able to sit with only one hand pressed to the desk and a trembling arm to support him. He never asked that question again. He saw the day when he stood on at a grimy wasteland of structures that had been a steel plant. It was closed and given up. He had bought it the night before. There was a strong wind and a gray light squeezed from among the clouds. In he saw the brown red of rust, like dead blood on the steel of the giant cranes, and bright green living weeds like gorged cannibals growing over piles of broken glass at the foot of walls. At a gate in the distance, he saw the black silhouettes of men. They were the unemployed from a rotting hut that had once been a prosperous town. They stood silently, looking at the glittering car he had left at the gate of the mills. They wondered whether the man on the hill was the Hank Reardon that people were talking about, and whether it was true that the mills were to be reopened. The historical cycle of steel making in Pennsylvania is running down, a newspaper had said, and experts agree that Hank Reardon's venture into steel is hopeless. You may soon witness the sensational end of the sensational Henry Reardon. That was 10 years ago. Tonight, the cold wind felt like the wind of that day. He turned to look back. The red glow of the mills breathed in the sky, a sight as life-giving as a sunrise. These, his stops, the stations which an express had reached and passed. He remembered nothing distinct of the years between. The years were blurred, like a streak of speed. Whatever it was, he thought, whatever the strain and the agony, they were worth it, because they had made him reach this day when the first heat of order of Reardon metal had been poured to become rails for Taggart Transcontinental. He touched the bracelet in his pocket. He had had it made from that poured metal. It was for his wife. As he touched it, he realized that he had thought of an abstraction called his wife, not of the whom he was married. He felt a stab of regret, wishing he had not made the bracelet. Then a wave of self-reproach for the regret. He shook his head. This was not the time for his old doubts. He felt that he could forgive anything to anyone because happiness was the greatest agent of purification. He felt certain that every living being wished him well tonight. To meet someone, to face the first stranger, and to say, "Look at me." People, he thought, were as hungry for a sight of joy as he had always been. Relief from that gray load of suffering which seemed so inexplicable and unnecessary. He had never been able to understand why men should be unhappy. The dark road imperceptibly to the top of a hill. He stopped and turned. The red glow was a narrow strip far to the west. Above it, small at a distance of miles, the words of a neon sign written on the blackness of the sky. Reardon Steel. He stood straight at the bench of judgment. He thought that in the darkness of this night other signs were lighted over the country. Reardon Ore, Reardon Coal, Reardon Lime. He thought of the days behind him. He wished it were possible to light a neon sign of them saying, Reardon Life. He turned sharply. As the road came closer to his house, he noticed that his steps were slowing down and that something was ebbing away. He felt the dim reluctance to enter his home, which he did not want to feel. No, not tonight. They'll understand it tonight. But he did not know. He had never defined what it was that he wanted to understand. He saw lights in the window when he approached his house. The house stood on a hill, rising before him like a big white bulk. It looked naked, with a few semi-colonial pillars for reluctant ornament. It had the cheerless look of a nudity not worth revealing. He was not certain whether his wife noticed him when he entered the living room. She sat by the fireplace, talking, the curve of her arm floating in graceful her words. He heard a small break in her voice and thought that she had seen him, but she did not look up and her sentence went on smoothly. He could not be certain. But it's just that a man of culture is bored with the alleged wonders of purely material ingenuity, she was saying. He simply refuses to get excited about plumbing. Then she turned her head, looked at Reardon in the shadows across the long room, and her spread gracefully, like two swan necks by her sides. "My darling," she said in a bright moment, "isn't it too early to come home? Wasn't there some slag to sweep or tuyères to polish?" To him, his mother, his brother Philip, and Paul Larkin, their old friend. "I'm sorry," he answered. "I know I'm late." "Don't say you're sorry," said his mother. "You could have telephoned." He looked at her, trying to remember something. "You promised to be here for dinner tonight." "Oh, that's right, I did. I'm sorry. But today at the mills, we poured..." He stopped. He did not know what made him unable to utter the one thing he had come home to say. He added only, "It's just that I forgot." "That's what Mother means," said Philip. "Oh, let him get his bearings. He's not quite here yet. He's still at the mills," his wife said gaily. "Take your coat off, Henry." Paul Larkin was looking at him with the devoted eyes of an inhibited dog. "Hello, Paul," said Reardon. "When did you get in?" "Oh, I just hopped down on the 5:35 from New York." Larkin was smiling in gratitude for the attention. "Trouble?" "Hasn't got trouble these days." Larkin's smile became resigned, to indicate that the remark was merely philosophical. "But no special trouble this time. I just thought I'd drop in to see you." His wife laughed. "You've disappointed him, Paul." She turned to Reardon. "Is it an inferiority complex or a superiority one, Henry? Do you believe that nobody can want to see you just for your own sake? Nobody can get along without your help." He wanted to utter an angry denial, but she was smiling at him as if this were merely a conversational joke, and he had no capacity for conversations which were not supposed to be meant, so he did not answer. He stood looking at her, wondering about the things he had never been able to understand. Lillian Reardon was generated as a beautiful woman. She had a tall, graceful body, the kind that looked well in high-waisted gowns. Empire style, which she made it a practice to wear. Her exquisite profile belonged to a cameo of the same period. Its pure, proud lines and the lustrous, light brown waves of her hair, worn with classical simplicity, did an austere, imperial beauty. But when she turned full face, people experienced a small shock of disappointment. Not beautiful. The eyes were the flaw. They were vaguely pale, neither quite gray nor brown, lifelessly empty of expression. Reardon had always wondered, since she seemed amused so often, why there was no gaiety in her face. "We have met before, dear," she said in answer to his silent scrutiny, "though you don't seem to be sure of it." "Have you had any dinner, Henry?" his mother asked. The reproachful impatience in her voice, as if his hunger were a personal insult to her. "Yes. No. I wasn't hungry." "I'd better ring to have them." "No, Mother, not now. It doesn't matter." "That's the trouble I've always had with you." She was not looking at him, but into space. "It's no use trying to do things for you. You don't appreciate it. I could never make you eat properly." "Henry, you..." said Philip. "It's not good for you." Reardon laughed. "I like it." "That's what you tell yourself." "It's a form of neurosis, you know." When a man drowns himself in work, it's because he's trying to escape from something. You ought to have a hobby. Oh, Phil, for Christ's sake, he said, and regretted the irritation in his voice. Philip had always been in precarious health. Doctors had found no specific defect in his loose, gangling body. He was 38, but his chronic weariness made people think at times that he was older than his brother. You ought to learn to have some fun, said Philip. Otherwise you'll become dull and narrow. You know, you ought to go private shell and take a look at the world. You don't want to miss life, the way you're doing. Fighting anger, Reardon told himself that this was Philip's form of solicitude. He told himself that it would be unjust to feel resentment. They were all trying to show their concern for him, and he wished these were not the things they had chosen for concern. I had a pretty good time today, Phil, he answered, smiling, and wondered why Philip did not ask him what it was. He wished one to ask him. He was to concentrate. The sight of the running metal was still burned into his mind, filling his consciousness, leaving room for anything else. You might have apologized. Only I ought to know better than to expect it. It was his mother's voice. He turned. She was looking at him with that injured look which proclaims the long-bearing patience of the defenseless. Mrs. Beecham was here for dinner, she said reproachfully. What? Mrs. Beecham? My friend, Mrs. Beecham. Yes? I told you about her. I told you many times, but you never remember anything I say. Mrs. Beecham was so anxious to meet you, but she had to leave after dinner. She couldn't wait. Mrs. Beecham is a very busy person. She wanted so much to tell you about the wonderful work we're doing in our school and about the classes in metal craftsmanship. Wrought iron doorknobs that the little slum children are making all by themselves. It took the whole of his sense of consideration to force himself to answer evenly. I'm sorry if I disappointed you, Mother. You're not sorry. You could have been here if you'd made the effort. But when did you ever make anybody but yourself? You're not interested in any of us or in anything we do. You think that if you pay the bills, that's enough, don't you? Money. That's all you know. And all you give is money. Have you ever given us any time? It meant that she missed him, he thought. Then it meant affection. And if it meant affection, just to experience a heavy, murky feeling which kept him silent lest his voice betray that the feeling was disgust. You don't care. Her voice went half spitting, half begging on. Lillian needed you today for a very important problem, but I told her it was no use waiting to discuss. Oh, Mother, it's not important, said Lillian. Not to Henry. He turned to her. He stood in the middle of the room with his trench coat still on, as if he were trapped in an unreality that would not become real to him. It's not important at all, said Lillian gaily. He could not tell whether her voice was apologetic or boastful. It's not business. It's purely non-commercial. What is it? I am planning to give a party. Oh, don't look frightened. It's not for tomorrow night. I know very busy, but it's for 3 months from now, and I want it to be a very big, very special affair. So would you promise me to be that night and not in Minnesota or Colorado or California? She was looking at him in an odd manner, speaking too lightly and too purposefully at once, her smile overstressing an air of innocence and suggesting something like a hidden trump card. 3 months from now, he said. But you know that I can't tell what urgent business might come up to town. Oh, I know. But couldn't I make a formal appointment with you way in advance? Just like any railroad executive, automobile manufacturer, or scrap dealer? They say you never miss an appointment. Of course, I'd let you pick your convenience. She was looking up at him, her glance acquiring some special quality of feminine appeal by being sent from under forehead up full height. She asked, a little too casually and too cautiously, "The date I had was December 10th, but would you prefer the 9th or the 11th?" "It makes no difference to me," she said gently. "December 10th is our wedding anniversary, Henry." They were all watching his face. If they expected a look of guilt, what they saw instead was a faint smile of amusement. She could not have intended this as a trap, he thought, because he could escape it so easily by refusing to accept any blame for his forgetfulness and by leaving her spur. She knew that his feeling for her was her only weapon. Her motive, he thought, was a proudly indirect attempt to test his feeling and to confess her own. A part of his form of celebration, but it was hers. It meant nothing in his. In hers, it meant the best tribute she could offer to him and to their marriage. He had to respect her intention, he thought, even if he did not share her standards, even if he did not know whether he still cared for any tribute from her. He had, he thought, because she had thrown herself upon his mercy. He smiled, an open, unresentful smile in acknowledgement of her victory. "All right, Lillian," he said quietly. "I promise on the night of December 10th. "Thank you, dear." Her smile had a closed, mysterious quality. He wondered why he had a moment's impression that his attitude had disappointed them all. She trusted him, he thought. If her feeling for him was still alive, then he would match her trust. He had to say. Words were a lens to focus one's mind, and he could not use words for anything else tonight. "I'm sorry I'm late, Lillian. But today at the mills we poured the first heat of Reardon metal." There was a moment of silence. Then Philip said, "Well, that's nice." The others said nothing. He put his hand in his pocket. When he touched it, the bracelet swept out everything else. He felt as he had felt when the liquid metal had poured through space before him. "I brought you a present, Lillian." He did not know that he stood straight and that the gesture of his arm was the burning crusader offering his trophy to his love when he dropped a small chain of metal into her lap. Reardon picked it up, hooked on the tips of two straight fingers, and raised it to the light. The links were heavy, crudely made. The shining metal had an odd tinge. It was greenish blue. "What's that?" she asked. "The first thing made from the heat of the first order of Reardon metal." "You mean," she said, "it's fully as valuable as a piece of railroad rails?" He looked at her blankly. She jingled the bracelet, making it sparkle under the light. "It's perfectly wonderful. What originality! I shall be the sensation of New York, wearing jewelry made of the same stuff as bridge girders, kitchen stoves, typewriters, and... What was it you were saying about it the other day, darling? Soup kettles?" "God, Henry, but you're conceited," said Philip. Lillian laughed. "He's a sentimentalist. All men are. But, darling, I do appreciate it. It isn't the gift, it's the intention, I know. The intention's plain selfishness, if you ask me." "Another man would bring a diamond bracelet if he wanted to give his wife a present, because it's her pleasure he'd think of, not his own. But Henry thinks that just because he's made a new kind of tin, why, it's got to be more precious than diamonds to everybody, just because it's he that's made it. That's the way he's been since he was 5 years old. The most conceited brat you ever saw. And I knew he'd grow up to be the most selfish creature on God's earth." "No, it's sweet," said Lillian. "It's charming." She dropped the bracelet down on the table, put her hands on Reardon's shoulders, and raising herself on tiptoe, kissed him on the cheek, saying, "Thank you, dear." He did not move. did not bend his head down to her. After a while he turned, took off his coat and sat down by the fire, apart from the others. He felt nothing but an immense exhaustion. He did not listen to their talk. He heard dimly that Lillian was arguing, defending him against his mother. "I know him better than you do," his mother was saying. "Hank Reardon's not interested in man, beast, or weed unless it's tied in some way to himself and his work. That's all he cares about. I've tried my best to teach him some humility. I've tried all my life." Failed. He had offered his mother unlimited means to live as and where she pleased. He wondered why she had insisted that she wanted to live with him. His success, he had thought, meant something to her, and if it did, then it was a bond between them, the only kind of bond he recognized. If she wanted a place in the home of her successful son, he would not deny it to her. "It's no use hoping to make a Henry, Mother," said Philip. "Meant to be one." "Oh, but Philip, you're wrong," said Lillian. "You're so wrong. Henry has all the makings of a saint. That's the trouble." What did they seek? Thought Reardon. What were they after? Just anything of them. It was they who wished to hold him, they who pressed a claim on him, and the claim seemed to have the form of affection, but it was a form which he found harder to win any sort of hatred. He despised causeless, just as he despised unearned wealth. They professed to love him for some reason, and they ignored all the things for which he could wish to be loved. He wondered what response they could hope to obtain from him in such manner, if his was what they wanted. And it was, he thought. Else why those complaints, unceasing accusations about his indifference? Why that chronic air of suspicion, as if they were waiting to be hurt? He had never had a desire to hurt them, but he had always felt reproachful expectation. They seemed wounded by anything he said. It was not a matter of his words or actions. Almost as if they were wounded by the mere fact of his being. Don't imagining the insane, he told himself severely, struggling to face the riddle with the strictest of his ruthless sense of justice. He could not condemn them without understanding, and he could not understand. Did he like them? No, he thought. He had wanted, which was not the same. He had wanted it in the name of some unstated potentiality which he had once expected to see in any human being. He felt nothing for them now, nothing but the merciless zero of indifference, not even the regret of a loss. Did he need any person as part of his life? Did he miss the feeling he had wanted to feel? No, he thought. Had he ever missed it? Yes, he thought, in his youth. Not any longer. His sense of exhaustion was growing. He realized that it was boredom. He owed them the courtesy of hiding it, he thought, and fighting a desire for sleep that was turning into physical pain. His eyes were closing when he felt two soft, moist fingers touching his hand. Paul Larkin had pulled a chair to his side and was leaning over for a private conversation. What the industry says about it, Hank. You've got a great product in Reardon Metal, a great product. It will make a fortune like everything you touch. Yes, said Reardon, it will. I just hope I run into trouble. What trouble? Oh, I don't know. The way things are nowadays. There's people who... But how can we tell? Anything can happen. What trouble? Hunched, looking up with his gentle, pleading eyes. His short, plumpish figure always seemed unprotected and incomplete, as if he needed a shell to shrink into at the slightest touch. Full eyes, his lost, helpless, appealing smile served as substitute for the shell. The smile, charming, like that of a boy who throws himself at the mercy of an incomprehensible universe. He was 53 years old. Your public relations aren't any too good, Hank, he said. You've always had a bad press. What? You're not popular, Hank. I haven't heard any complaints from my customers. That's not what I mean. You ought to hire yourself a good press agent to sell you to the public. What for? It's stealing. But you don't want to have the public against you. Public opinion, you know, it can mean a lot. I don't think the public's against me. And I don't think that it means a damn one way or another. The newspapers are against you. They have time to waste. I haven't. I don't. It's not good. What? What they write about you. What do they write about me? Well, you know this. That you're intractable. That you're ruthless. That you won't allow anyone any voice in the running of your mills. That your only goal is to make steel and to make money. But that is my only goal. But you shouldn't say it. Why not? What is it I'm supposed to say?
Okay, I'm going to stop right there. I'm going to stop this video and make another one to shorten it up, part 2.